Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. As the sun set over the town where Cole and I grew up, we waited to test the new headlight we had just installed. This new light is much bigger and more powerful, so it should be a significant upgrade over stock, not to mention it looks great. With the sun almost at the horizon, Cole got on his bike and headed to the top of the trail on the road. Then, we waited for complete darkness. As you can see, the headlight is extremely bright. It's hard to tell in this comparison, but the light is much brighter and casts a far more usable beam than the stock headlight. Alright, so the first step in the installation is to remove the headlight. If you have a direct mount stem like us, you will want to undo all 4 bolts and then slide the headlight bracket out. If you have the standard stem, you will need to upgrade to a direct mount for our solution to work well. Careful when loosening the bolts as the headlight can fall off and scuff your forks. Once you have the headlight off, now is a good time to cut the wire. We cut the wire around where it goes into the triple trees. Now it's time to cut the stock tabs that held the light off of the bracket. You could use a hacksaw and sandpaper for this part, but we had access to power tools, so that was the obvious choice. Cut the tabs as close to the base as possible to minimize the sanding and grinding. After the tabs are cut, use some form of sanding to remove the sharp edges. A sanding wheel and an impact works well, but we also used a belt sander to get it as flat as possible. Next, center punch a hole in the base between the 2 tabs you just cut off. This hole will need to be drilled to the size of the bolt you choose to insert here. This will make more sense in a minute. While drilling, make sure to make a small pilot hole, unlike us, to avoid the bit walking on you. As you can see, Cole had to fight the bit to get it back to center after it had walked on him. This is the bolt that will slide through. It will be used to extend the bracket that came with the light away from the frame so it can be angled down. Now would be a good time to undo the key switch and the USB outlet. There are 2 4mm Allen heads holding it down. There are a lot of wires tucked behind this piece, so be gentle when pulling on them. After it comes out, you want to identify the wire that led to your stock headlight. This is where we will be wiring in the switch and new light. Now, this is where we decide to put our switch, so we are going to lightly center punch this with a rubber mallet. Nothing major, just enough to start the bit. Speaking of the bit, we are using a 3/4 inch spade bit. The size you will need can generally be found in the specs for the switch. Now again, please don't be like us, take your battery out so that there is no risk of punching into it. Make sure to press lightly as not to crack the plastic, let the bit do most of the work. Here's what it looks like all said and done, perfectly centered. Now is when you can start feeding your switch wires through. Once the switch is in place, don't forget to secure it with a nut on the backside. We found an adjustable wrench works best when tightening the nut. The wires are now ready to be stripped. Prepare all your wires now so that you don't need to in the middle of soldering. This would be a good time to test fit the new light and stick the wires into the battery area for wiring. Make sure to have everything routed properly before doing any soldering. So instead of you walking through how to wire our exact system, I'm just going to show you a wiring diagram that may help you for your setup. We just don't want to be too specific as we know people may choose other options. To start with, this is an LED switch, meaning that it will need its own power and ground to light up. A more simple switch may just be 2 prongs to splice in between only your power line. Make sure that all of your grounds are tied together properly. It's also important to mention that this light runs on a 5 amp fuse, so you need to be careful with how much power you are drawing. To check this, divide the power of the light you want by 12 volts, and if that number is greater than 5, the light will draw too many amps. Here's a quick time lapse of us wiring everything together. A couple quick pointers: always put your heat shrink on the wires before you solder them. You don't want to have to do this twice. Make sure you are leaving enough slack so that your battery case can easily open and close. and the light has enough room to be adjusted. Finally, for the soldering, it goes a lot smoother if you coat all of your wires in flux before making the solder connection. Something else that's kind of interesting is that when you buy switches, you don't always know what you're going to get. Same with the lights. So for example, this switch had 4 wires coming off of it, and 2 prongs were positive and 2 prongs were negative. So you would expect 2 red wires and 2 black wires. That's what we had. However, one of our red wires were power and the other red wire was a ground. And then we had 1 black wire that was positive and 1 black wire that was ground. So you just always need to be paying attention for little things like that companies will mess up on. Now, reinstalling the switch plate can be a little tricky, so what you want to do is you want to feed some of the wires around either side of the key switch and the USB hub, and then kind of put the bottom in first, then push the top in, then reinstall those 2 Allens. Alright, so normally we don't do any live voiceovers, but felt fitting for this, so I'm going to try to explain what we ended up doing with this bracket here to get it to work. So back in here is the original bracket right there, and that bolt that we put in during the installation, we actually had to put in a bolt that was significantly longer than the bolt that came with it. This here is the bracket that came with this light, and generally you would just throw the bolt that comes through into whatever you're mounting it for. These lights in particular were for a Jeep, but what we had to do was find a longer bolt here so we could extend it away from the frame. And then we had to 3D print another one of these spacers to move our stem up. You can find a link for these spacers, the STL file, if you want to print one. They also sell them on eBay. Just look up direct mount stem spacer. Here's a look at those spacers close up. And for anyone who's questioning the strength of a 3D printed part, this is 100% infill. So there's basically no air in there. And plastic has pretty high compressive strength when stacked like this. But we also did some strength testing, which we will show you now.
Are you able to go further?
Lance, you look like a strong young pup. Why don't you see if you can give that a nice tear? Don't hurt yourself now. Can't do it.
Oh, that broke it.
But we have 2 of those. These are 12 millimeters each, so 24 millimeters. And then on top of that right here, we have the original headlight bracket that came with the Sur-Ron. That is bent slightly upward. So if you look from this angle, you can see that bolt back there is facing upward relative to the horizontal plane. And we had to do that for a couple reasons. One, that light needs to be able to get angled backwards like this, so that when you're looking outward with the light, it's not facing up. You want your light to be facing more downward on the trail. If you were to just install it your way without extending that or raising it up, you just basically be lighting up the sky. Another reason, if you look down here, we unfortunately dinged up the new Fox 40s. Not good. That happened because we did not have that 3D printed spacer in there, and anytime that this would go full compression, this here was running into the bottom of the headlight. So we had to move that up. These are 8-inch travel forks, I think 203 mils. So the distance from here to the bottom of your headlight needs to be 8 inches. That's just something to keep in mind. That's the same for the D&M fork. But the D&M fork doesn't have a cross stanchion, so you don't really have to worry about that as much. Up here on top, I've just taken and ran 2 zip ties on either side of this bolt that's in here. And what that allows it to do is, since it's a central pivot, the light wants to move side to side or rotate like this. But what that does is it keeps the light steady so that it's not constantly twisting while you're riding. And if you take a look here on the back side of the light, there's a piece of foam there, and that's there so if you go off a jump, you can see there's a little bit of flex in this. And if you hit a hard landing and it flexes all the way back, you're gonna want a piece of foam there. So that one, it doesn't mark up your frame, but two, there's no noise and it's not making an annoying rattling sound. A couple more things on this bracket here. I had to shave some down so that you could physically take the light and rotate it downward more. The bracket was hitting on some of these heat sinks on the back. And then down here, oh, here's a good angle. We had to actually take and cut out some of the heatsink fans so that we could rotate it back further without those heatsink fans coming and interfering with the front of the frame here. So, you know, there's a couple things that you're gonna have to do to get this light working, but when you compare it to the $200+ Fisher Fab House light, I personally think this looks better. I think it performs just the same, and it's about a quarter of the cost. So yeah, you have to do a lot more work to get this one to be at that level, but I think it's totally worth it in the long run. Finally, before we go, little teaser here, we finally got the ASI controllers on the bike. We've got these brackets made for it. These are gonna get done in powder coated aluminum, so they're gonna be really nice. The only brackets I've seen for these so far have been 3D printed, just like these, but these are a prototype. Up here, we're gonna make these holes slotted so that you get a little bit adjustability when putting it into the holes back here. But it's a work in progress. We have to email almost every day with ASI. There's multiple hundreds of parameters that can be adjusted. So really, it's just a waiting game. We're trying to get harnesses worked out so this can be a plug-and-play solution, all that. But we will have videos coming out on that in the near future. Thanks everybody for watching. If you're interested in more content like this, please consider subscribing.